will be uplifted. So we're going to transition to the panel discussion now. Tamika Lecluse, American River Flood Control Board trustee, and community organizer Nailah Harden will be joining us for the panel. They both presented earlier, as well as Water Forum Executive Director Tom Gohring and Anecita Agustinez. So we've heard throughout the day, we know climate change is going to create these bigger challenges in water supply, flood, ecosystems, and our communities. But we also have heard, we also know that disadvantaged communities face increased risk from these changes. They're likely to be hit harder. Racism, colonization, poverty, all of these systems of oppression, they manifest in our water system. And we have a real responsibility to address these issues of environmental justice, to try to change course and really address the roots of these problems. So that's what we want to ask questions about during this panel, because we're celebrating 20 years of the Water Forum, and we're also looking forward to what's next. So my questions are going to be aimed at uncovering some solutions. And my first question is to Anecita. Anecita, your presentation focused on traditional ecological knowledge a bit, and I want to ask you, in the role that Water Forum plays, as you said, as a steward and as an organization that integrates science and modeling into making better water management decisions, how do we better integrate the value of traditional ecological knowledge? How do we involve tribes in planning beyond that stakeholder role? And perhaps in the language of that last statement from Governor Newsom that you mentioned, what does good co-management look like on the Lower American River?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great discussion piece, and I think that question can also be something that you create and address it as a board, as staff, because tribes are there. They're your partners, they're your neighbors. But do they come to the table without knowing that the organization that they're going to be speaking with will be listening, will be welcoming? And so what I tell agencies who've not had meaningful tribal engagement, the first start and the first practice is look at your mission statement. And I really think that environmental justice definition, because if you look at someone's mission statement, what are your priorities, what are your core values, and if those core values are reflective of your own, then you feel invited. You feel like there's a common ground there. And then take a look at your website. Does your website show that you are creating community partners? And is there an opportunity for tribal involvement within that community that you serve? And that does not get done overnight. That takes lots of engagement, meaningful engagement. It's creating advisory committees that are more than just advisory committees, that are not just being the take, give us information. It's really creating the give and take of feeling that it's meaningful. And for tribes, that means, well, we know that tribes are still living and enjoying that watershed and practicing their traditional values. Are those traditional values going to be shared with the community at large? Because then they're exposing sensitive and cultural areas. So you have to have the conversation of what is going to be sensitive, what's going to be maintained as sensitive. And then do you do co-management that allows access? And how do you handle your public that says, well, why are the tribes getting a beneficial or a benefit that we're not engaging it with? Because that always happens. Communities who don't understand what tribes have gone through will always say, well, they're getting a benefit that we can't partake in. And that's true. You're not a tribal citizen. You're not a tribal government that has been resilient and survived, and you've had to practice your religion in secret over all these years because if people knew that, then they would all be going and trying to gather in traditional areas that were ceremonially used. And we do know that sacred sites that have been exposed end up being areas that get pilfered and get defaced, even to this date. So I think that those conversations are really the first steps into creating those partnerships. But I think understanding internally your core values and what can you do internally to address those concerns that always come up.
Thank you so much. So I want to ask our other panelists a broader question about community participation. And I think, Nailah, you did a great job of talking about this in your presentation, that disadvantaged communities are always asked to show up and donate their time and just kind of hope that they're rewarded with better decisions. And community participation in environmental decision-making is extremely valuable. So how do we value people's time? How do we meet communities where they're at? How do we be inclusive and overcome engagement barriers and actually achieve that part of the environmental justice definition that is equal access to decision-making power? Nailah, I'd like to start with you.
All right. So I think a lot of it is going to have to go against how we're already doing things. And so I think we have to really think, we have to meet people where they are. We have to go to where people are, and we can't just expect people to come to our meetings. I think for folks who have access to program guidelines and how grants are administered, writing in a community-based organization is a wonderful way. Being able to pay people to participate is another wonderful way. Providing technical assistance to communities is another great way. And I think just being really clear, I think being really clear about what communities' baseline needs are, and being able to bring multiple resources. So an example, just real quick, right, is we have groups, like a few years ago, we redid our RT transportation plan, and they wanted to have a conversation with us about bus routes and how to make bus routes more distinct. Well, we want to have a conversation also about where the grocery stores are. And we also need to have a conversation about where the jobs are, because you can't just have one siloed conversation. Our communities have so many compounded issues that we need to start having those more holistic conversations where we're talking about the intersections of some of these. So we have 10 people who come to write our opinions about in 10 different plans, when we really should be using all those resources to figure out what is one plan to really lift a community up.
That's great, thank you. I'd like to also address that question to you, Tamika, and I want to give a little shout out to a question that popped up that we didn't get a chance to ask you, and I think it's really related to this. I wonder if you'd like to talk about your work with the American River Flood Control District and the community participation work you're doing there.
Thank you. So right away, I joined the Community Outreach Committee. Just because I wanted to be a part of that dialogue. Really, the messenger really matters sometimes, right? And a lot of times, even in these kinds of circles, there is a language barrier. And I don't just mean language like in the foreign language sense. Like, there is a language barrier where an organization with great intentions comes into a community like my community of Del Paso Heights or South Sac, where Nailah is, or Oak Park, and coming and saying, this is what we are going to do for you. And it's all of these things that people don't really understand. Like, flood control wasn't like a normal part of dialogue growing up. We were about survival, right? That's what I understood as a kid. I understood survival. And so when you're coming into communities of color, you have to understand that for a lot of folks, their bar is at survival. And coming in with all this extra stuff isn't what they need. And really what Nailah said is like, where's the grocery store? How come I got more liquor stores than I got places to buy formula? So those are some real issues. I think coming into a community is just meeting people where there are and checking, checking for those language barriers. We've had a lot of consultants come into our community that didn't speak the language, the love language of our community. And so they check their box, they get paid by the government, and they're never seen again. And we get nothing. And so we have to definitely check for those barriers in communication and language. But I also think that it's important, representation matters. I'm the first Black woman to sit on the flood control district in almost 100 years. The other person of color sits on it with me, Cyril Shaw. And this is today. Representation really matters in these circles. I feel much more comfortable going into Oak Park and speaking the love language of my community than maybe our superintendent is, or somebody from another community. And so, yes, love language in all meetings. That's what, those are the kind of connections, the human connections we need to get back into, and not just checking boxes with our activism and engagement.
That's great, thank you. And I want to ask Tom to talk a bit about Water Forum's efforts around better public engagement.
Yeah, I'll just say a few words because I feel like my job here is more listening than talking on this panel. At the Water Forum, I think we're playing catch up. I think not catch up out of a bottle, catch up. We're trying to catch up. Thanks, Tamika, for that, for the chuckle. We have prided ourselves on being inclusive with people from the areas of water management and the environmental community, but we are behind the times in being inclusive with some huge corners of our community. And we're just getting started on trying to make some amends there, where we actually have a process in place where our public caucus, one of the 4 caucuses in the Water Forum, is trying to reach out to community organizations and start this dialogue. And it's, I'm an old guy, and these conversations are a little scary for us, right? We're having to admit that we have fallen short in some areas, and I don't think that's easy, but we're trying to frankly suck it up and start the conversation. I am trying to be really mindful not to do exactly what I think I heard Tamika say a minute ago, which is to just demand the information. And so we're learning. Frankly, we're just in learning mode to try to find out how. When I hear you say meet us where we are, I haven't figured out where that is yet, but I want to.
Thanks, Tom. I think it's really valuable to see you addressing that and learning. Thank you very much. I want to ask a question now about reparations. California's governor recently signed a bill establishing a task force to study and make recommendations on reparations for slavery. We're witnessing this kind of moment of reckoning on a national level around racial inequality. And as Nailah said, environmental justice, it's being talked about more. And we also know that the legacies of slavery and of genocide against Native Americans touch all aspects of our infrastructure, like water. So I want to ask you each about what reparations look like for water in the Sacramento region, specifically in your community, and what does it mean to not dance around questions of equity? Anecita, I'd like to start with you if you're comfortable.
Sure. I think the issue of reparations has been at the forefront of any tribal person or any tribal citizen, any tribal nation, because of just the knowledge of the atrocities that they've had to undergo. California history is just rife, as well as federal government history, with termination, relocation, and the policies, to literally exterminate, our people. If you look at one of the resources, Executive Order N1519, that's also known as the Apology. Governor, just one of that was early in Governor Newsom's first term, his first 6 months. It was an apology on behalf of the citizens of California for and he actually said genocide and slavery and the enslavement of Native American people. And so reparations it's going to be a difficult conversation, because when people think of that, they're going to think of monetary. And for tribal governments, and I can't speak for tribal governments. I mean, I'm speaking from what's been shared with me, and also as a tribal citizen in understanding these issues, is that it's never going to be about the monetary compensation. We've been given those promises over and over again. When those 18 treaties were signed, there was a monetary compensation after discovery, after 50 years, when it was disclosed. Well, you've been thinking you've had the cover of resources, and it wasn't there. And so the monetary discovery has that conversation's been given to Native Americans, and so they're not going to believe that. And that goes with the distrust of government. So Truth and Healing Council, that was developed by that governor's order, is looking at those reparation issues, looking back at land back. And part of the governor's new administration on ancestral land is looking at excess land, excess natural lands under state-owned control, to be returned back to California's tribal citizens and tribal governments. And so when it comes to reparations for tribes, I think foremost, beyond land itself, is the establishment and acknowledgement from time immemorial of tribal water rights. And I think that if I were a California tribal citizen, that would be the first thing I would be mentioning at every opportunity, is recognition of these tribal water rights. Because when tribes were terminated at the time of California's 1850s and the 20s and the 60s and the 70s, and then reinstated back in some as recently as the 1990s and 2000s. Well, they're being reinstated back on land that does not have that first date of their tribal water right. So what happens then? Because as we know, during the times of drought, when we had to deal with water rights issues and senior and priority users, that is a very major, big discussion. And so when we're talking about, water rights that started in 1914, and the Winter's Doctrine allowing for tribal water rights from 1908, and then the recent Agua Caliente case that says that groundwater is recognized under the Federal Reserve Doctrine of Winter's Doctrine rights. So that is something that I think is going to be a significant discussion that legal scholars and tribal scholars are going to have to addressing from that California viewpoint of reparations in California. So it's, for me, working with tribes, I know it's beyond just land. It would be the access to water rights and to all the intended rights within that, cultural practices, fishing rights, and access to land. And if I could just mention one more thing, you talked earlier about engagement, Tom. I think was another thing I wanted to mention during my talk was the recognition under TEK, tribal ecological knowledge, of that tribal knowledge allows for the same parity as a climate scientist, because this is a recognition that they are subject matter experts. They are the subject matter experts on the lands that they steward. And I think that that's a really good first step in acknowledging that, and then learning to share that information.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I also want to ask that question maybe to Nailah first. What do reparations look like for Black and Brown communities in Sacramento experiencing environmental racism?
Yeah, you know, it's funny to me that this conversation is such a tough conversation to have, because I come from a community where resources are always taken out. And so like, I think that folks fear about, like, if we have a conversation about reparations, stuff is being taken away. I'm like, Tuesday? That's Tuesday for us. Like, so I think it's just really interesting to me, the tension and the discomfort folks feel talking about reparations, because I think that there's so many creative ways that we can think outside of the box to answer this question. And it goes back to, like, the idea that we're not actually going to get to where we need to be in terms of our climate unless we take this question seriously. And we can frame it and put, like, other words that feel a little bit more palatable than reparations on them, but it's the same thing. Like, what does it look like? So what could it look like? I think my creek, right? There's creeks run all throughout California, Sacramento. What it looks like is revitalizing all the creeks, especially in disadvantaged communities, so people have access to open spaces and water, and we can restore ecological habitats and bring in native plants and native species into disadvantaged communities. What does it look like? It looks like there's a ton of vacant lots and abandoned homes, and how do we repurpose that? How can we put solar gardens there? Like, there's so many more fun, creative, beautiful ways we could be talking about reparations and investing in these communities and investing in the people who live in them. That it's really interesting that the first place most people go is like, what's going to be taken away from me? Like, no, how can we all benefit? And so, yeah, I'll just end it there.
Okay. Tamika, I saw you smiling and nodding. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, it is a hard question. And my first answer, which, you know, I ended it with a period, was like, nothing's going to be enough. I mean, quite honestly, and, you know, and just looking, because you have our tribal lands and our native people, you have Black slaves that were brought here against their will. You have folks who have been displaced from their communities. It's not going to be enough, right? So that's my short answer. But, you know, what Nailah said, like, that is what reparations looks like. Crossing of the bike trail in my neighborhood of Del Paso Heights across the levee looks much different than taking the bike trail in River Park or East Sac or the American River Parkway. I have to look down a lot more often to be sure that, you know, I'm being careful where I step. There's no tree canopy. It's hot over here and dry, and the levees are very tall. Our water is foggy. When we moved in a year and a half ago, it was brown. The water at Grant High had lead levels similar to Flint, Michigan. This was 2019. Reparations for me and my community means that, just like Nailah said, we will have beautiful parkways. We will have nice, clean places to walk safely. We'll be able to enjoy the water banks and enjoy the river, like other folks who can kind of, you know, I have folks over by Ansel Hoffman and William B. Pond, and they could just leave their house and walk to this lovely river, and it's gorgeous, right? I park my car at their house and walk to the river because it's gorgeous. But that's not a privilege that my community has. We are just trying to survive. Our biggest fight is we're like, hey, you know, a lot of folks have been pushed out of the central city into my community where the levee is. We have a huge houseless problem. There's trash piled up on Norwood Avenue, which is on this side of me, and Rio Linda, which is behind me. Reparations would mean that when I leave out of my house and I go on my walk in the evenings with my kids and my husband and maybe my cat, that I can see and I can feel and I can hear and I can smell all of the same things, whether it's my community or the community of American River Parkway, or whether it's River Park or East Sac or Tahoe Park or Oak Park downtown. That's what it looks like.
Thank you so much. I'm hearing you say it's big, it's immeasurably large, and also many maybe smaller things. And I hope that there's a role for local governments and for intergovernmental agencies like the Water Forum to play some role in that, and for us to be thinking about that as we move forward. And we're running short on time, but I don't want to skip this second to last question. I heard Nailah and Tamika, you both talked about homelessness in your presentations. And I've worked at the Water Forum for 3 years, and I've heard these conversations about the ways in which homelessness contributes to water contamination. There's a lack of services, and homeless people dig into levees, and it's this problem that people are causing this problem. And what I hear is largely a language of dehumanization. And so I want to ask you, how do we address these issues, which are real issues, without placing that burden on the most marginalized people in our communities? How do we combat that dehumanizing narrative and actually address the issue?
I'd like to start with this one, because this is something that's literally I think about every day, and it came up again. How homelessness, folks experiencing homelessness, and really punitive ordinances and policies that are passed without a whole lot of folks knowing, that are really, really detrimental to these folks getting out of their state of poverty, right? And homelessness. And so when we are looking at, when I am thinking about this, and when we are looking at how to protect our levees, right? We know that the bacteria levels of, I believe it was earlier last year, after water, we know that the bacterial levels were really high. What I understand from my community work in Sacramento is that we are also living on top of really old pipes. But all of the conversation, all of the blame was on homeless people. That's what I saw. Not the system that got them homeless, not the fact that rents are too damn high, not the fact that folks are being displaced from their communities as we give our funding for arenas and for sports parks and all of these really wonderful things that not every community member can really enjoy. And so when we're looking to see, well, or when we're looking at some of the issues, when we're looking at the cutouts in the levee, when we're looking at the number of homeless people experiencing homelessness, when we look at the trash, we're looking at a system that failed people. And so my job as an elected official, and hopefully a re-elected official, is to build those relationships with other entities, other folks, other water resource districts, other flood control districts, DWR, the city of Sacramento, the county of Sacramento, to say, look, we are all responsible and we all need to come to fix this, because we cannot blame people experiencing homelessness on a broken system that failed them. And we need to be ambassadors for people and work towards fixing broken systems.
Thank you so much. And I want to give Anecita a chance to answer this question very quickly too, before we go to our last question and the audience exercise.
I just wanted to just make an observation and comment on the unsheltered communities, and working with them, working with tribal governments, going along, looking at sites and looking at the levees, knowing that the levees themselves, were our villages and on the watershed, but a large percentage of the homeless population, not only in Sacramento but throughout California, are Native Americans. And so, the unsheltered population, you know, there are people, and they're just not a statistic, and they're just not a problem per se that we look at as causing, you know, the trash problem and all the other negative connotations that we see about that. But thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much. So my last question here, it's a question to our 4 panelists, and it's also a question to the audience. And my colleague Grace Kaufman is going to join us for this section and help me engage with your responses in the chat. So this question, it's intended to fire up our imaginations because, you know, we've heard today the future is going to be different than the present. Climate projections tell us this without a doubt. But optimistically, the future doesn't have to look like the present, but worse, right? So I want to ask you to paint a picture of what you imagine a better future might look like, or smell like, or taste like, or feel like. The question is, what do you see or hear, smell, taste, feel when you imagine a better, more equitable future for water, climate, and communities in the Sacramento region? Short 30-second answer from our panelists and audience members. Chat your response. Let's start with Tom.
I think that I'm still envisioning Nailah's photo of her son. And so one of the things I envision in a future is an opportunity for every kid in Sacramento to find within bicycling distance of their home a natural landscape that they can spend an afternoon in and feel like they belong, feel like they've gained an understanding of the natural world, and to feel like that's going to be there during, not only during their childhood, but after they're adults.
Thanks, Tom. How about Nailah?
Yeah, similar to Tom's, right? I have a beautiful little black boy. I envision him on the creek at the elementary school. He gets to ride his bike over the bridge that we're gonna build to the community center for the after school program. And I'm not worried about his safety or his education or anything like that. If we're really talking about dreaming and you're telling me I can have my Porsche, then I pick him up and we bike ride along Morrison Creek all the way down to Clarksburg, have a little wine at a winery, you know. Well, he doesn't have wine, I have the wine. And it's a perfect world, so don't ask me how I'm gonna drunk bike back. Don't listen, this is my beautiful world, so don't. But we bike back in our neighborhood and we just get to see a bunch of wildlife and vegetation, and we get to bike ride through communities and never worry about safety or anything like that.
Beautiful. Anecita, how about you?
I close my eyes, and I do this a lot, and I appreciate the question. I envision all the waterways with undammed, all the waterways unobstructed, with all the salmon returned and all the fish species healthy, and that I could walk and cup my hands and drink the water straight from that riverbed and that stream.
So lovely. Tamika?
When I was little, one of my favorite things to do in Sacramento was to catch tadpoles. I loved catching tadpoles. When I moved back here to Del Paso Heights, I went to some of the creeks where I used to catch tadpoles as a kid. I was like, oh, I'm gonna teach my kids. Like, this is, you know, I wanted them to have the same experience that I did. Like, look, catch, you know, see them and release them, and you go down and you'll hear all of the different sounds of all the frogs in the evening time when you go down to the creek looking for your tadpoles. My kids don't have that experience. I don't know really of a whole lot of kids here who do. And that's sad to me. I enjoyed that as a kid here in Sacramento, but our creeks are not safe or clean enough for our kids. And in a perfect world, you know, they would be. People would be more kind to one another and more compassionate and more fair in a perfect world. And water wouldn't be something that people fight over, but something that people embrace and share and use only and use in a very intentional way that leaves enough for 7 generations to come, right? We're always thinking 7 generations ahead. That's what I want to see.
Great, thank you. So we just have a couple minutes left. Grace, would you help me call out some of these responses maybe in the chat? I'm just like flooded with all of these beautiful visions for the future.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm just scrolling through here. Every single human being with access to clean and sufficient access to water and close community with a healthy, thriving ecosystem. I see clear blue skies. I hear bird chirps. I taste delicious, revitalizing water. I feel proud that I collaborated with all of my Sacramento neighbors to create a more equitable water system. Let's see. Public access to our waterways is completely free. New greenways are constructed from urban neighborhoods to them. Public transportation is easy to support all communities. Ability to reach the region's wonderful water places. More people from up and down the watershed to be able to enjoy it as a clean, thriving ecosystem. About it. Sorry if I missed, folks. There were a lot coming in there.
Could I add just one more thing to this conversation? In the future, these conversations will be as diverse as Sacramento.
That is a fantastic addition. Thank you.
Can I have not a last word? Can I have one more word, Kat?
Why not?
Can I guess I'm gonna make a personal pledge that I'm gonna try to bring that goal into the water forum.
That's an excellent.
And thanks for stating it that way so I can get my head around it.
It's what teachers do.
Well, thanks to all of you. It's been a really great discussion. I think you've all been like really excellent teachers speaking from the heart. And I feel like it was inspirational based on all of the comments that I'm seeing come through.